The time for caution is over. That was the rallying cry issued by the General Secretary of the Scottish Trades Union Congress, Ros Foye. The annual gathering of union members took place this week in Dundee and was addressed by First Minister John Swinney and Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar. The major theme of the Congress was the rise of far-right politicians. Ms Foye told this programme it was time to name those people who she called the problem and challenge them for unacceptable comments they have made. The rise of right-wing extremism, how worried should people be about this as an issue?
I think people should be very worried. It was one of the highest number of motions we got in that was composited into our debate this morning, and so it's certainly something that our members right across the economy are concerned about. I think you can see it's evident in public life, in public discourse, in our politics, in our media, in our schools, in our social media, and the influences that are affecting our young people. And we all need to be united in drawing a line in the sand and saying this is not where we want to see Scotland going.
And in your view, you talked about a lot of broad brush potential examples there. What, in your view, are the kind of concrete examples of how this impacts on people's everyday lives?
Well, some of the debate we heard this morning from our members was really quite disturbing. I think particularly in our schools, the influence of social media on our young people, the rise of misogynistic and racist and transphobic views, and actually the rising number of attacks and hate crimes against people from minority and vulnerable groups. These are all real and tangible examples, attacks on teachers as well as other pupils, and a rise in violence in our society.
And how do you combat that? It's one thing to have motions passed at a gathering of trade unions, but how does that actually change anything, or what needs to be done if you were to try and tackle some of these issues?
Well, the reason why we welcomed the First Minister calling his summit was because the first step is to recognise that we have a problem here in Scotland, and to start to understand more about what's causing that problem. And some of that is about recognising there is a global movement of the right, of the extreme right, and they are funding much of the social media, the influencers, and the political parties in some cases that are espousing some of the real negativity, the othering, the scapegoating that is now entering our politics and our discourse in society.
Exactly who do you think is doing that in the Scottish context?
Well, I think that we have some very difficult politics entering Scotland in the shape of reform, and people like Nigel Farage, the leader of reform, are known people with extreme right-wing views. I would describe him as of the far right. I think some of his racist, sexist rhetoric in the past, there are numerous examples, is unacceptable to have in our politics, the scapegoating of certain groups. And that is what the right does. They feed on people's discontent. And I suppose that's the other part of what needs to be done. Our political parties who are in government right now, our Scottish government, our UK government, have to take some of the responsibility for this. You
called Reform a far-right party. They have and would and have on the record disputed that.
Yes.
Do you think that organising summits without parties like Reform there to talk about the rise of the far right just alienates people further and feels like there's folk in ivory towers telling them why they shouldn't be voting the way they are?
No, I don't think it does. I think there's a risk if we are trying to say that anyone who might be interested in voting for a party like that is racist. But let me be very clear, I don't think that is the case at all. I think that people, ordinary working people, are feeling fed up, they're feeling disillusioned, they're fed up with broken promises, they're feeling exploited, and it doesn't surprise me in the least that they are looking for answers out with our mainstream politicians. And our mainstream politicians have to take responsibility for that and realise that they have been making too many promises that they are then breaking, that they are not dealing with how they actually impact on the material wealth of ordinary working people, and they're not taking on the billionaire class and making sure the wealth that should be distributed throughout our economy to support people is. And so when you have a situation like that, that is when forces of the right are able to really exploit the situation and breed discontent. When people feel they're being treated unfairly, it's quite right that they should question our mainstream politicians. And I think there's a responsibility on the trade union movement and others to say the far right are not the answer, they are liars.
Do you think then that Keir Starmer has failed to a degree with Labour in government? Have they been a disappointment and failed to stem the drift of people away from, as you would say, that kind of mainstream politics and towards parties like Reform?
Well, I am disappointed in the UK government's performance so far. I actually feel that they need to be very careful that they are not moving to the right themselves. I'm disappointed with their rhetoric on migrants. I'm disappointed that they've chosen to punch down when dealing with the changing worldwide political situation, in terms of looking to cut foreign aid budgets, looking to cut benefits to our disabled. There is a need to look at how we do things in our economy, but we should be talking about wealth taxes. We should be talking about the extreme wealth that exists at the top of our economy and actually being prepared to take that on and distribute it. We should be talking about how to make fuel bills affordable for people right here, right now. The UK government has the power to do that. I've not seen enough action on that front.
And closer to home at Holyrood, has the SNP done enough over the last 18 years in power to make people feel better off?
Well, that's exactly the point. We've had 18 years of the SNP government, and they have talked the talk, and I don't think they've done enough walking the walk when it's come to social justice and building that wellbeing economy, that Fair Work Scotland that they talk about. I was heartened to hear the First Minister take on our challenge and take on board the fact that they needed to do more, much more, and I'll actually be watching with interest what he's going to bring forward now in his programme for government on the 6th of May. I hope the politicians, because I certainly wasn't backwards in telling them at the summit, realise that this needs to be a wake-up call, that they need to make a material difference to the lives of ordinary working people, and they need to do it now.
Do you think that message got through? Because one of the things that seemed striking in the press conference afterwards, particularly John Swinney's language, was a lot more temperate than it had been in advance of the summit.
Well, I think that there are many theories about, making sure that we don't do more harm than good when talking about the far right, that we don't give them more exposure, and that we don't, give them more fuel. But I think the time for caution is over, and I certainly think that we need to call out the problem. We need to name those who we think are associated with the problem, and we need to actually start taking them on and having the debate. People like Farage are no friend of working people. They don't support employment rights. They don't support taxing the rich. They don't support redistributing wealth in the way that we would support.